The rain hammered against the cobblestones of Chartres Street like bullets, each drop exploding into fragments that shimmered in the gas lamplight before disappearing into the perpetual mud of New Orleans. Summer 1838, and the city sweated with a heat that seemed to rise from something rotten beneath the elegant facades of the French Quarter. Marie Laveau pressed herself against the rain-slicked wall on Dauphine Street, her thin cotton dress soaked through. She was 17, though her eyes carried the weight of someone far older. 3 days ago, she had been working for the Beauregard family on Royal Street. Then, Monsieur Beauregard discovered $200 in gold coins missing from his study, and despite Marie's tearful protests, she was cast into the streets with nothing but her clothes, and a reputation that would follow her like a shadow. She had not stolen the money. Jacques, the eldest son, had taken it for gambling debts. But Jacques had made clear that if she spoke his name, she would be found floating in the Mississippi. So Marie chose silence, and silence chose her fate. For 3 days she wandered the streets, sleeping in doorways, eating scraps from behind restaurants. Churches and charitable societies turned her away once they heard she'd been dismissed for theft. Every door slammed shut at the mention of her name. On the 4th day, as Marie sat beneath an oak in Jackson Square, dizzy with hunger, an older woman appeared beside her. She was perhaps 50, with knowing eyes that made Marie uncomfortable. "You look hungry, child," the woman said. She handed Marie 3 pralines. Marie devoured them gratefully. "You got nowhere to go," the woman said flatly. "No work, no money. I've seen girls like you before." Marie wanted to protest, but the words died in her throat. "There's a place," the woman continued. "Silver Springs Road, big white house. Madame Delacroix runs it. She takes in girls like you, gives them work, food, shelter. The work ain't pretty, but it's work." Marie's stomach tightened. "What kind of work?" "The kind that keeps you alive. Madame runs a proper establishment, not like the cribs by the docks. Her girls got nice dresses, clean beds, protection." She paused. "It ain't what you dreamed of, but for a girl like you, it might be the best offer you'll get." "I'll think about it," Marie said. "Don't think too long. This city don't wait for nobody. You change your mind, go to Silver Springs Road. Tell them Cecile sent you." Marie waited 2 more days, trying desperately to find another way, but no one would help her. On the 6th day, she began walking towards Silver Springs Road. The house stood alone on a slight rise, white columns and black shutters, elegant yet isolated. Wrought iron fence, flowering bushes. To Marie's exhausted eyes, it looked like sanctuary. She stood at the gate, feeling the weight of her decision. Then pushed through and walked to the front door. It swung open before she could knock. A woman stood there, perhaps 35, with auburn hair and a burgundy silk dress. Beautiful in a cold, precise way. Pale green eyes studied Marie intensely. "You must be Marie," the woman said, her voice cultured with a hint of French accent. "Cecile told me you might come. I am Madame Delacroix. Come inside." The interior was cool and elegant, crystal chandelier, expensive wallpaper, immaculate cleanliness. Madame Delacroix led Marie to a sitting room where a maid brought lemonade and cakes. Marie ate desperately while Madame watched with amusement. "You've had a difficult time," Madame said. "The Beauregard family treated you poorly. Such things happen in this city." "How did you know?" Marie asked, startled. "I make it my business to know things. Information is currency here." She leaned forward. "This is a house of pleasure. My girls entertain gentlemen of means. I don't run a common brothel. My establishment caters to judges, merchants, politicians, men who require discretion. The work is demanding, but you'll be well compensated. Your own room, good food, fine clothes." Marie's stomach tightened. "And if I want to leave?" Something flickered in Madame's eyes. "Of course you may leave once you've worked off your debt. I'll be investing considerably in you. New dresses, training, medical care. That money must be repaid. It's only fair." What choice did she have? "I accept," Marie said, and triumph flashed across Madame's face. "Excellent. Come, let me show you your room. You'll begin training tomorrow." The room was small but elegant. Clean linens, a washstand, an empty wardrobe. A window overlooked the gardens and the wild vegetation beyond. "Rest," Madame said. "Tomorrow your new life begins." She left, locking the door from the outside. Marie collapsed onto the bed and wept silently. From somewhere in the house came a brief scream, quickly cut off, followed by complete silence. Marie told herself it was nothing. But as she drifted into exhausted sleep, she could not shake the feeling she had made a terrible mistake, that the door she'd walked through was not an entrance, but the ceiling of a tomb. She dreamed of fire and iron, of pain that settled into the bones. When she woke before dawn, she smelled smoke and heard faint weeping behind the walls, as if the building had absorbed the sorrow of everyone who'd passed through its doors. Morning came harsh and bright. The maid who'd served lemonade brought breakfast and a simple dress. "Madame says put this on and come downstairs. Training starts at 9. Don't be late." Her eyes wouldn't meet Marie's. "I'm Claudette. I work in the kitchen. How long have you been here?" Fear crossed Claudette's face. "Long enough to know asking questions is a bad idea. You'll learn that if you're smart." The training room, as Madame Delacroix called it, was on the ground floor at the back of the house. It was a large space that might once have been a ballroom, with tall windows that let in floods of light and mirrors mounted on the walls that reflected and multiplied everything within. 7 other girls were already there when Marie arrived, ranging in age from what looked like 15 to perhaps 25. They stood in a loose group, all dressed in similar simple cotton dresses, all with the same expression of wariness mixed with resignation. Madame Delacroix stood at the front of the room, dressed now in a severe black dress that made her look like a particularly elegant headmistress. Beside her stood a man Marie had not seen before, tall and heavy-set with a florid complexion and cold eyes that assessed the assembled girls with the calculating gaze of a livestock buyer examining potential purchases. "Good morning, ladies," Madame Delacroix said, her voice cutting through the murmured conversations. "For those of you who are new, let me introduce Monsieur Beaumont. He is responsible for security here at the house, and he ensures that our operations run smoothly and that you are all kept safe from any unpleasantness. You will treat him with the utmost respect and obey his instructions without question. Is that clear?" A murmured chorus of agreement rippled through the assembled girls, and Marie joined in, though something about Monsieur Beaumont made her skin crawl. He looked at them not as people, but as property, as things to be managed and controlled, and his smile when he caught her staring was predatory and knowing. "Today we begin with the basics," Madame Delacroix continued. "How to walk, how to speak, how to laugh at a gentleman's jokes even when they are not funny, how to make a man feel as though he is the most fascinating creature in all of creation. These skills may seem simple, but they are the foundation of your success here. A gentleman does not merely want physical satisfaction, he wants the illusion of desire, the fantasy that you find him as irresistible as he finds you. You must become actresses, skilled in the art of performance, able to project whatever emotion or attitude the situation requires." She began to demonstrate, showing them how to move with grace, how to angle their bodies to appear more inviting, how to use their eyes and smiles as weapons of seduction. It was deeply uncomfortable, reducing human interaction to a series of calculated gestures and manipulations, but Marie forced herself to pay attention and to practice along with the others. This was her life now, at least temporarily, and survival required adaptation. The morning stretched into afternoon, with only a brief break for lunch served in the training room. Madame Delacroix was an exacting teacher, quick to criticize any perceived flaw in posture or delivery, and more than once Marie saw her strike one of the girls across the face when the response to correction was not sufficiently immediate or enthusiastic. The other girls seemed unsurprised by this, which suggested it was a regular occurrence, and Marie filed that information away, adding it to the growing catalogue of concerns that were beginning to accumulate in her mind. It was late afternoon when Madame Delacroix finally dismissed them, instructing them to rest before dinner and to prepare themselves mentally for the evening ahead. As the girls filed out of the training room, Marie found herself walking beside a young woman with strawberry blonde hair and freckles that dusted her nose and cheeks like gold dust. "I'm Marie," she said quietly, and the other girl nodded. "Catherine. I've been here 3 months." She glanced around to ensure they were not being overheard, then added in a whisper, "Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you and don't react. Don't try to leave. Don't try to run. They'll catch you, and when they do, the punishment is worse than you can imagine. I've seen girls try. I've seen what happens to them. Just keep your head down, do what you're told, and maybe eventually you'll get out. But don't hope too hard. Hope is dangerous here." Before Marie could respond, Catherine had quickened her pace and moved away, leaving Marie standing alone in the hallway with a cold knot of fear forming in her chest. She made her way back to her room on legs that felt suddenly unsteady, and as she climbed the stairs, she noticed for the first time that there were locks on the outside of all the bedroom doors, heavy brass mechanisms that could seal the occupants inside. Dinner was served in a communal dining room on the first floor, a long table with the girls seated on both sides and Madame Delacroix at the head. The food was excellent, roasted chicken and vegetables and fresh bread, more than Marie had eaten in the past week combined, but she found it difficult to swallow around the lump of apprehension that had lodged in her throat. The other girls ate in silence, their eyes fixed on their plates, and the only sound was the clink of silverware and the occasional murmured comment from Madame Delacroix. After dinner, they were dismissed to prepare for the evening's entertainments. Marie was led to her room by Claudette, who wordlessly laid out a dress on the bed, a creation of deep blue silk, with a neckline that plunged lower than anything Marie had ever worn. There were also undergarments, stockings and shoes, with small heels that Marie knew would make walking a challenge. "Put these on," Claudette said, still not meeting Marie's eyes. "Madame will send for you when she's ready. Your first gentleman is a regular, very generous, very particular about what he likes. Just do what he tells you and don't make trouble." "Claudette," Marie said desperately, catching the woman's arm as she turned to leave. "Please, tell me the truth. What is this place really? What happens to the girls here?" For a moment, something that looked like pity crossed Claudette's face, and her carefully neutral mask slipped just enough for Marie to see the pain and fear beneath. "This place," she said quietly, "is a hell that looks like heaven, and Madame Delacroix is a devil who wears the face of an angel. That's all I can tell you. That's all anyone needs to know." She pulled her arm free and was gone, leaving Marie alone with the blue silk dress and the growing certainty that she had walked into something far worse than she had imagined. She changed mechanically, her hands trembling as she fastened the dress and tried to arrange her hair in some semblance of the style Madame Delacroix had demonstrated earlier. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her, this strange creation dressed in silk and fear. The summons came an hour later, a knock at the door followed by Monsieur Beaumont's gravelly voice announcing that she was needed downstairs. Marie followed him down to the ground floor, through corridors she had not yet explored, to a wing of the house that was clearly designated for entertaining. The rooms here were luxuriously appointed, with velvet drapes and plush carpets and furniture that spoke of wealth and sensuality. Music drifted from somewhere nearby, piano notes that seemed to hang in the air like questions without answers. Monsieur Beaumont stopped outside one of the doors and turned to face Marie, his expression impossible to read in the dim lamplight. "A word of advice, girl. Make the gentleman happy. Make him very happy. Because if he complains to Madame about your performance, she will not be pleased. And trust me when I say you do not want to experience her displeasure. Do you understand?" Marie nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady, and Monsieur Beaumont opened the door and gestured her inside. The room beyond was dimly lit by candles, casting everything in flickering shadows that made it difficult to see clearly. A man sat in an armchair by the window, his back to the door, and as Marie entered he turned to look at her. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair and a face that might have been handsome once, but was now marked by the excesses of good living, jowls, and a florid complexion that spoke of too much rich food and wine. He wore expensive clothes, and his fingers glittered with rings that caught the candlelight. His eyes, when they met Marie's, were flat and cold, assessing her in a way that made her feel less than human. "Come here, girl," he said, his voice carrying the assumption of authority, of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Let me look at you properly." Marie moved forward on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and the man reached out and took her chin in his hand, turning her face this way and that, as if examining a piece of merchandise. His breath smelled of cigars and brandy, and his touch made her skin crawl with revulsion that she fought desperately to conceal. "You'll do," he said finally, releasing her chin. "Madame Delacroix said you were new, and I do so enjoy breaking in the fresh ones. They still have spirit, still have some fight left in them. That makes it more interesting, wouldn't you say?" Marie wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to claw at his smug face until the expression of entitled satisfaction was replaced with something else. But she remembered Catherine's warning and Monsieur Beaumont's threat, and she stood frozen in place as the man rose from his chair and approached her with deliberate slowness, savoring her fear as if it were a fine wine to be appreciated and enjoyed. What followed was something Marie's mind tried desperately to separate itself from, to create a distance between the physical body being used and the essential self that retreated somewhere deep inside where it could not be touched. The man took his time, clearly enjoying her discomfort and distress, and when it was finally over and he dismissed her with a casual wave of his hand and a handful of coins tossed onto the dresser as if she were a servant being tipped for satisfactory service, Marie felt something inside her crack, a fundamental shift in how she understood herself and the world. She made her way back to her room in a daze, Monsieur Beaumont shadowing her to ensure she went directly there and did not attempt anything foolish. Once inside, with the door locked from the outside, she collapsed onto the bed and wept silently, pressing her face into the pillow to muffle any sound. She wept for her lost innocence, for the choices that had led her to this place, for the future that stretched out before her like an endless desert with no oasis in sight. She must have fallen asleep eventually because she woke to early morning light streaming through her window and the realization that she had survived one night in this place, and now she would have to survive another and another after that. An infinite series of survivals that stretched out to a horizon she could not see and did not want to contemplate. The days began to blur together after that, a repetitive pattern of training and preparation and performance that ground away at Marie's sense of self like water-eroding stone. She learned quickly because the alternative to learning was punishment, and Madame Delacroix's punishments were creative and cruel. She saw other girls beaten for minor infractions, saw them locked in the cellar for days without food or water, saw them emerge broken and compliant, all spark of resistance extinguished from their eyes. She learned that the house operated on a strict hierarchy. At the top was Madame Delacroix, absolute in her authority, a queen ruling over a kingdom of exploitation and suffering. Below her was Monsieur Beaumont, enforcing her will with casual brutality. Then came the girls themselves, ranked by how much money they brought in, how well they performed their assigned roles. Those at the top received slightly better treatment, slightly more freedom within the confines of the house. Those at the bottom lived in constant fear of falling even further, of being sold to a cruder establishment or simply disappearing one night, their fate left to speculation and nightmares. Marie tried once, in her second week, to escape. She had noticed that one of the windows in the training room had a broken latch, and she waited until the middle of the night, when she thought everyone would be asleep, to try her luck. She managed to get the window open and was halfway through when a hand clamped down on her ankle and dragged her back inside. It was Monsieur Beaumont, his face twisted with an expression that might have been anger or might have been anticipation of what was to come. He said nothing, just grabbed her by the hair and dragged her down to the cellar where Madame Delacroix was waiting. The cellar was a stone-walled chamber that might once have been used for wine storage, but now served a darker purpose. Marie could see iron rings set into the walls and dark stains on the floor that she tried desperately not to think about. "So you tried to leave us," Madame Delacroix said, circling Marie with the measured pace of a predator. "After all we have done for you, after we took you in when you had nothing, this is how you repay our kindness? With betrayal and ingratitude?" "Please," Marie begged, the tears she had promised herself she would not shed streaming down her face. "Please, I'm sorry. I won't try again, I swear. Just please don't hurt me." Madame Delacroix smiled, and it was the most terrible thing Marie had ever seen, an expression of pure malevolence dressed up in beauty. "Oh, my dear child, I am going to hurt you. I am going to hurt you very much indeed. Not because I am cruel, you understand, but because you need to learn. All my girls need to learn that there is no escape, that this is their life now, that resistance is futile and painful. It is a lesson best taught through demonstration." She nodded to Monsieur Beaumont, who moved to a corner of the cellar and returned carrying something that made Marie's blood freeze in her veins. It was a branding iron, the kind used to mark cattle, but instead of letters or numbers, the end was shaped into an elaborate symbol, a stylized letter D surrounded by decorative flourishes. "Every girl in my house bears my mark," Madame Delacroix said conversationally, as if discussing the weather or the latest fashion from Paris. "It identifies them as mine, as property of this establishment. Usually we do this after a girl has been here a month, once we are certain she is suitable for long-term investment. But for you, my dear Marie, we will make an exception. Consider it an accelerated education in the realities of your new life." Monsieur Beaumont had been holding the branding iron in the flames of a brazier that glowed in the corner of the cellar, and now the metal had taken on a dull red color that pulsed with heat. Marie tried to run, tried to fight, but Monsieur Beaumont was immensely strong, and he held her easily, while Madame Delacroix approached with the glowing iron. "This will hurt," Madame Delacroix said almost kindly. "It will hurt more than anything you have ever experienced. But pain is a teacher, and this lesson will stay with you for the rest of your life. Hold her still, Monsieur Beaumont. We want the mark to be clean and clear." The pain, when it came, was beyond anything Marie had imagined possible. It was not just a physical sensation, but a violation that reached down into the core of her being and branded not just her skin, but her soul itself. She screamed, a sound that seemed to go on forever, echoing off the stone walls and filling the cellar with the music of agony. She could smell her own flesh burning, could feel the metal searing into her, leaving a mark that would never fade, a permanent reminder of who owned her now. When it was finally over and Monsieur Beaumont released her, Marie collapsed to the floor, barely conscious, the pain radiating through her body in waves that threatened to drown her completely. Through the haze of agony, she heard Madame Delacroix speaking, her voice coming from very far away. Take her back to her room. Let her heal for a few days before putting her back to work, and let this serve as a lesson to all the girls. There is no escape from this house. There is only acceptance and obedience. Those who learn this truth quickly will suffer less. Those who resist will suffer greatly. The choice, such as it is, belongs to each of you. Marie spent the next 3 days in her room, the burn on her shoulder throbbing with relentless pain that no amount of laudanum could fully dull. Claudette came twice a day to change the bandages and bring food, but she said nothing, her face carefully blank, as if what had happened in the cellar was merely routine maintenance, rather than a horror that should shake the foundations of any moral universe. On the 4th day, Marie was summoned back to work. The burn had begun to heal, though it would leave a scar, a raised patch of skin that bore the elaborate D of Madame Delacroix's ownership. It was placed on her left shoulder, high enough to be easily concealed by clothing, but positioned so that it could be displayed if necessary, a permanent mark of her status in this place. She resumed her duties with a mechanical compliance that she recognized as a defense mechanism, a way to protect what little remained of her sense of self. She learned to dissociate during the encounters with the gentleman callers, to send her mind somewhere else while her body performed the required actions. She learned which clients were relatively benign and which were dangerous, which ones to avoid if possible and which ones to simply endure. She learned that some of the other girls had been here for years, trapped by debts that never seemed to decrease, no matter how much money they earned, caught in a mathematical impossibility designed to ensure they remained property in perpetuity. It was in her 3rd month at the house that Marie first heard about the others, the girls who had disappeared. She was in the kitchen, helping Claudette prepare vegetables for dinner, when one of the newer girls, a terrified 16-year-old named Josephine, who had only been at the house for 2 weeks, asked what had happened to the girl who had occupied her room before her arrival. The question hung in the air like smoke, and every woman in the kitchen froze, as if a sudden chill had passed through the space. Claudette's face went pale, and she gripped the knife she had been using with enough force that her knuckles turned white. "That's not a question you ask," one of the older girls. "A woman named Lisette," said sharply. "You understand? That's not something we talk about." But Josephine, still new enough to have some remnant of courage, pressed on. "But I heard noises last night coming from below, like someone crying or screaming. And this morning, when I asked about it, everyone acted like I was crazy, like I hadn't heard anything at all. I'm not crazy. I know what I heard." Claudette set down her knife very carefully and turned to face Josephine, and her expression was a complex mixture of fear and pity and something else, something that might have been a desperate kind of warning. "Some girls," she said slowly, choosing her words with evident care, "don't make it here. They can't handle the work, or they cause too much trouble, or they try to leave one too many times. When that happens, Madame has to make decisions about what to do with them, and those decisions, well, they ain't always pleasant." "What kind of decisions?" Marie heard herself ask, though part of her desperately did not want to know the answer. Claudette looked at her for a long moment, and Marie could see the internal debate playing out across her face. Finally she said, "The kind of decisions that mean those girls don't leave this house walking on their own 2 feet, if you catch my meaning. The kind of decisions that leave marks in the cellar floor that no amount of scrubbing can remove. The kind of decisions that turn this place into a tomb for those who can't or won't comply." The kitchen had gone completely silent, and Marie felt as though she had suddenly fallen through ice into freezing water, everything crystallizing into sharp clarity. This was not merely a house of exploitation, not just a prison that masqueraded as a business. This was something darker, something monstrous, a place where human life could be extinguished with casual efficiency, and no one beyond these walls would ever know or care what had happened. "How many?" Marie whispered, though she was not sure she wanted the answer. Claudette's eyes were wet with unshed tears, and when she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion, held too long in check. "I've been here 7 years. I've lost count of how many girls I've seen disappear. Dozens, maybe more. They come in desperate and hopeful, and then the hope dies, and then they die, or they become so broken that death would be a mercy. And Madame just keeps bringing in new ones. Fresh supply to replace the used-up merchandise. It never stops. It never ends." That night, Marie lay in her locked room and stared at the ceiling, her mind working furiously through the new information. She thought about the laws that were supposed to protect people, about the courts and the police and all the structures of civilization that were meant to ensure justice and prevent atrocity. But those laws, she was beginning to understand, only applied to people who were considered fully human in the eyes of society. Girls like her, women who had fallen or been pushed into this shadow economy of flesh and exploitation, were invisible to the mechanisms of law, and their suffering was simply the cost of doing business in a city that had always thrived on the labor and pain of the powerless. She began to pay closer attention after that conversation, watching and listening for patterns that might reveal the full extent of what was happening in this place. She noticed that Madame Delacroix kept meticulous records, ledger books that detailed every transaction, every client, every payment made and received. She noticed that certain girls, the ones who were most resistant or who seemed on the verge of breaking completely, would be called to Madame's office for private conversations, and some of those girls would emerge looking even more terrified than before, while others would not emerge at all. She learned from whispered conversations with the other girls that the cellar held more than just the branding iron and the implements of punishment. There were rooms down there that no one was allowed to enter, spaces that remained locked even during the day, and from which strange sounds would sometimes emanate in the deepest hours of night. Some girls speculated that Madame Delacroix used those rooms to dispose of girls who could no longer work, either because of illness or injury, or simply because they had outlived their usefulness. Others whispered darker theories about occult practices and rituals, though Marie suspected these were mostly the products of fear and imagination, trying to make sense of horrors that defied rational explanation. What was clear, what became more evident with each passing day, was that this house operated with complete impunity. Powerful men came through its doors regularly, men whose names Marie recognized from newspapers and political discussions, judges and legislators and businessmen who wielded enormous influence in New Orleans society. They were complicit in what happened here, not just through their patronage, but through their silence, their willingness to look away from the suffering that facilitated their pleasure. Madame Delacroix had carefully cultivated relationships with these men, had gathered enough information about their visits and their predilections to ensure that none of them would dare to speak against her, that her operation would remain protected by a conspiracy of powerful perverts who valued their reputations more than they valued human life. It was in her 5th month at the house that Marie finally met someone who might represent a chance at justice, or at least exposure. His name was William Garrison, and he was unlike any of the other clients who frequented Madame Delacroix's establishment. He was younger, perhaps 30, with an intensity in his eyes that suggested intelligence and principle. He was also, she learned through careful conversation, a journalist and abolitionist who had recently moved to New Orleans from Boston. He had come to the house, he admitted during their second encounter, not for the usual purposes, but as part of an investigation into the shadow economy that existed beneath the glittering surface of New Orleans society. He had heard rumors, whispers of places where women were held against their will, where violence and exploitation were routine, and he was trying to gather evidence that might be used to force the authorities to take action. The problem, he told Marie as they sat in the room that was supposed to be the scene of their transaction, is that no one wants to hear the truth about these places. They are too profitable, too deeply embedded in the economic structure of the city. The men who run things, the men who make the laws, they are often the same men who profit from this trade in human misery. How do you fight a system where the people who are supposed to enforce justice are the same ones who benefit from injustice? Marie felt something she had not felt in months, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. "If I told you what happens here," she said carefully, "if I gave you evidence of the things Madame Delacroix has done, the girls who have disappeared, the violence and coercion, would that be enough? Could you use that to stop her?" William Garrison looked at her with an expression that was equal parts compassion and frustration. "I could try," he said. "I could write articles. I could take the information to the authorities. I could make enough noise that they would have to at least investigate. But I won't lie to you. The chances of success are slim. Madame Delacroix has powerful friends, and she has undoubtedly accumulated compromising information about many of them. They will protect her to protect themselves. Still, if you are willing to speak, if you are willing to testify, then I will do everything in my power to bring her to justice." Marie thought about this for a long moment, weighing the potential consequences. If she cooperated with Garrison and his efforts failed, if Madame Delacroix discovered that she had been sharing information, the punishment would be beyond anything she had yet experienced. But if she said nothing, if she simply continued to endure, then she was complicit in her own destruction and in the destruction of every girl who would come after her. "I'll help you," she said finally, "but you have to promise me something. If this doesn't work, if Madame finds out and comes after me, you have to find a way to get me out of here, even if it means smuggling me onto a ship leaving the port. Even if it means hiding me until I can get out of Louisiana entirely. Promise me you won't leave me to face her alone." "I promise," Garrison said, and there was something in his voice that made Marie believe him. "Now tell me everything. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." She told him about her arrival at the house, about the training and the branding, about the clients and their particular cruelties. She told him about the girls who had disappeared and about Claudette's whispered revelations in the kitchen. She told him about the locked rooms in the cellar and the sounds that emerged from them in the night. And as she spoke, she watched his face grow paler, his expression shifting from determination to horror and back to determination again, hardened now by the knowledge of exactly what he was fighting against. "I need proof," he said when she had finished. "Testimony is important, but physical evidence is better. The ledgers you mentioned, the ones where she keeps records of everything, if I could get access to those, or even copies of some of the pages, that would be invaluable. Is there any way you could manage that?" Marie thought about the layout of the house, about Madame Delacroix's habits and routines. Her office is on the first floor near the back of the house. She keeps the ledgers locked in a cabinet, but I've seen where she keeps the key. It would be incredibly dangerous, but if I could get in there during one of the evenings when she's entertaining in the front parlor, I might be able to make copies of a few pages. "Only do it if you can manage it safely," Garrison warned. "I don't want you taking unnecessary risks. Your testimony alone might be enough, especially if I can convince some of the other girls to come forward as well." But Marie knew that testimony would not be enough, not against someone as well-connected and ruthless as Madame Delacroix. If there was going to be any chance of stopping her, they needed evidence that was incontrovertible, proof that even the most corrupt officials would find difficult to ignore. "I'll do it," she said, "but I'll need time to plan it properly. Give me a week and then come back. I'll have something for you by then." The next 7 days were an agony of planning and anxiety. Marie studied Madame Delacroix's movements, noting when the office was empty and when it was occupied, identifying windows of opportunity that might be exploited. She befriended one of the other girls, a woman named Elise, who had been at the house for 2 years and who shared Marie's desperate desire for escape, and together they devised a plan that was risky but might work if luck was with them. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening when Madame Delacroix was hosting a large gathering in the main parlour, a special event for several legislators who were in town for sessions at the State House. The entire house was focused on that entertainment, with all the attention directed toward keeping the powerful guests satisfied and unaware of anything happening elsewhere in the building, while Elise created a distraction by feigning illness and requiring Monsieur Beaumont's attention. Marie slipped into Madame Delacroix's office through a side door that Elise had managed to unlock earlier in the day. The room was exactly as Marie had expected, furnished with heavy dark wood and dominated by a massive desk that spoke of authority and control. Behind the desk was the cabinet where the ledgers were kept, and Marie's hands trembled as she used the key she had managed to steal earlier that week to open it. The ledgers were there, 3 thick volumes bound in leather, and Marie pulled out the most recent one with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped it. The pages were filled with Madame Delacroix's neat handwriting, columns of numbers and names and dates that documented years of exploitation in meticulous detail. There were records of purchases, how much had been paid to acquire each girl, either through direct sale or through manipulation of desperate circumstances. There were records of earnings, what each girl had brought in, though when Marie looked at the corresponding debt columns, she saw that the amounts owed never seemed to decrease, interest and fees accumulating faster than any payments could offset them. And there, near the back of the ledger, was something even more damning, a list of names under a heading that simply read, "Disposals." Marie counted 23 names, girls who had entered the house and never left, whose fates were marked with brief notations. Drowned Mississippi River, buried North Field, sold to Natchez Operation. Each entry was dated and signed with Madame Delacroix's initials, a bureaucratic notation of murder dressed up in the language of business efficiency. Marie's hands were shaking so badly now that she could barely hold the ledger, but she forced herself to focus, using paper and pencil she had brought with her to copy down as much as she could. She documented names and dates, the most damning entries, the evidence of systematic exploitation and murder that had been occurring for years with no one beyond these walls knowing or caring. She had been in the office for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Marie's heart stopped, and for a moment she was paralyzed with terror. If she was caught here, with the ledger open and evidence of her theft spread across the desk, there would be no mercy, no second chances. She would become another name in that terrible list, another disposal to be noted and filed away. The footsteps passed by without stopping, and Marie forced herself to breathe again. She quickly put the ledger back in the cabinet, locked it, and gathered up the papers she had been using for her notes. She was just moving toward the door when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The distinctive voice of Madame Delacroix, coming closer, speaking to someone, probably Monsieur Beaumont. There was no time to reach the door she had entered through. Instead, Marie dove behind the heavy curtains that covered the window, pressing herself against the wall and praying that the fabric would conceal her presence. A moment later, the office door opened and light from the hallway spilled in. "The evening is going very well," Madame Delacroix was saying. "The representatives are quite pleased with the entertainment, and I believe we will secure their continued patronage. However, I have received some disturbing news. That journalist, Garrison, has been asking questions again, trying to speak with some of the girls. We may need to take steps to discourage his interest." "What kind of steps?" Monsieur Beaumont's voice, always gravelly and rough. "The permanent kind, if necessary. He is becoming too much of a nuisance, and we cannot afford to have him stirring up trouble. I want you to look into his movements, find out where he lives, who he associates with. If he continues to be a problem, we will arrange for an accident. The streets of New Orleans can be very dangerous for those who do not watch where they are going." Marie's breath caught in her throat. They were planning to kill Garrison, to eliminate the one person who might be able to help expose what was happening in this place. She had to warn him, had to find a way to get this information to him before Madame Delacroix could act on her threat. The conversation in the office continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Madame Delacroix checked something in her desk, gave Monsieur Beaumont some additional instructions about security for the rest of the evening, and then they left, closing the door behind them. Marie waited until she could no longer hear their footsteps, then emerged from behind the curtain on legs that felt like water. She made it back to her room without being detected, which felt like a miracle, and spent the rest of the night sitting on her bed, clutching the papers she had copied and trying to decide what to do next. Garrison was not scheduled to return for another 3 days, but she could not wait that long. Not with Madame Delacroix planning violence against him. She needed to find a way to get a message to him, to warn him, and to pass along the evidence she had gathered. The next morning, during the brief period when the girls were allowed outside to walk in the gardens, Marie managed to catch Catherine alone. "I need your help," she said urgently, keeping her voice low. "I need to get a message to someone outside the house. It's urgent, life or death." Catherine looked at her with an expression that was equal parts fear and curiosity. "That's incredibly dangerous. If Madame finds out you're trying to communicate with someone beyond these walls, she'll kill you. She's done it before." "I know," Marie said, "but if I don't do this, someone else will die, and all of this," she gestured at the house looming behind them, "will continue forever. I can't let that happen. I won't let that happen." Catherine studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, give me the message and the address. I know one of the gardeners who works on the ground sometimes. He might be willing to deliver something for the right price." Marie quickly wrote out a note to Garrison, explaining what she had overheard and urging him to be careful, to take precautions against whatever Madame Delacroix might be planning. She included the address of the house and a plea for him to come as soon as possible, that she had the evidence he needed. She folded the note carefully and handed it to Catherine, along with 2 of the coins she had managed to save from client tips, payment for the gardener's cooperation. The next 2 days were an agony of waiting and worry. Marie went through her routines mechanically, performing her duties with the clients, while her mind was elsewhere, constantly wondering if the message had been delivered, if Garrison had received it, if he would come before something terrible happened. She watched Monsieur Beaumont carefully, trying to determine from his behavior whether Madame Delacroix had already moved against Garrison. But the man's face revealed nothing beyond its usual expression of brutal competence. On the evening of the 2nd day, just after dinner, there was a commotion at the front of the house. Marie heard raised voices and the sound of multiple people entering, then Madame Delacroix's voice cutting through the chaos with sharp authority. A few minutes later, one of the younger girls came to Marie's room with a message. Madame wanted to see her immediately in the main parlour. Marie's heart sank. This was it then. Somehow Madame had discovered what she had done, the theft of information and the attempt to communicate with Garrison. She considered trying to run, but where would she go? The doors were locked. Monsieur Beaumont and his men controlled all the exits, and even if she managed to get outside, she would be hunted down within hours. There was no choice but to face whatever was coming and hope that somehow she might survive it. The scene in the main parlour was not what she had expected. Garrison was there. But he was not alone. With him were 3 other men, all carrying themselves with an air of authority that suggested official capacity. One of them, a heavy-set man with a thick moustache and cold eyes, was clearly in charge, and he was engaged in a heated discussion with Madame Delacroix, who stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "I am telling you, Sergeant Murphy, that these accusations are completely unfounded," Madame Delacroix was saying, her voice tight with anger. "Mr. Garrison has clearly misrepresented the nature of my establishment. This is a respectable house where young women are employed in perfectly legal activities. If some of them have chosen to embellish their circumstances to gain sympathy, that is not my responsibility." "Perfectly legal activities," Garrison said, his voice dripping with scorn. "Is branding young women like cattle a legal activity in Louisiana, madame? Is murder and disposal of inconvenient employees part of your legal business model?" Sergeant Murphy held up a hand, silencing both of them. He turned to look at Marie, and his expression was unreadable. "You're Marie, I presume. Mr. Garrison here has made some very serious allegations about what goes on in this house. He claims you have evidence to support these allegations. Is that true?" Marie felt every eye in the room turn toward her, and she knew that this moment would determine everything that came after. If she confirmed Garrison's allegations, Madame Delacroix would destroy her, if not immediately then, eventually. As soon as the authorities left, and the protective gaze of the law was turned elsewhere. But if she said nothing, if she denied everything to protect herself, then the horror would continue, and the deaths would continue, and she would be complicit in all of it. She thought about her mother, who had always told her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act rightly despite fear. She thought about all the girls who had disappeared, whose names were recorded in Madame Delacroix's ledger of death, who had no one to speak for them, no one to demand justice on their behalf, and she knew what she had to do. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have evidence. I have copies of Madame Delacroix's records documenting years of exploitation and murder. I have the names of girls who were killed and disposed of, including details of how and where. I have proof of systematic branding, of forced labor, of violence and coercion that amounts to slavery in all but name." The silence that followed her words was absolute, broken only by Madame Delacroix's sharp intake of breath. "You foolish little bitch," the woman said, her voice low and venomous. "Do you have any idea what you have just done? Do you understand that you have signed your own death warrant?" "Perhaps," Marie said, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. "But at least I won't die silent. At least someone will know what you are, what this place really is." Sergeant Murphy cleared his throat. "Miss Marie, I will need to see this evidence you mentioned. And Madame Delacroix, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about the operations of this establishment. Mr. Garrison, if you would be so kind as to wait outside with your colleagues, I believe we can handle matters from here." What followed was a blur of activity that Marie would later struggle to remember clearly. She retrieved the papers she had hidden in her room, the copied pages from Madame Delacroix's ledgers that documented the full extent of the horror. Sergeant Murphy examined them with an expression that shifted from skepticism to grim acknowledgement as the evidence accumulated before him. Other officers arrived and began searching the house, and when they found the locked rooms in the cellar and saw what was contained within, even hardened policemen turned pale and had to step outside for fresh air. The girls were gathered in the main parlor and questioned one by one, and though many were too frightened to speak openly, enough of them confirmed Marie's account that the full picture began to emerge. This was not merely a house of prostitution, though that would have been bad enough. It was a place where women were held as property, where violence was routine, where death was an acceptable solution to any problem that arose. and it had been operating for years, protected by Madame Delacroix's connections to powerful men who valued their pleasure and privacy more than they valued human life or dignity. Madame Delacroix was arrested that night, along with Monsieur Beaumont and 2 other men who had assisted in the operation of the house. The girls were taken into protective custody, though Marie would later learn that protective custody was a euphemism for another form of confinement, merely one with slightly better conditions and the theoretical possibility of eventual release. The trial, when it finally happened 6 months later, was a sensation that consumed New Orleans society. The newspapers published daily accounts of the testimony, though the details were often sanitized to protect the sensibilities of proper readers. Marie testified for 3 days, describing in exhaustive detail the conditions in the house, the violence she had witnessed and experienced, the girls who had disappeared. Other women testified as well, their voices shaking but determined as they spoke truths that had been locked away too long. Madame Delacroix sat through it all with an expression of cold fury, occasionally whispering to her lawyers but never showing the slightest hint of remorse or shame. Her defense team argued that she was merely a businesswoman, operating in a trade that society hypocritically condemned in public while enthusiastically supporting in private. That her alleged victims were willing participants who had later fabricated stories to gain sympathy or evade their debts. They called character witnesses who testified to her generosity and community involvement, painting a picture of a woman who had been unjustly maligned by disgruntled employees and crusading journalists with an agenda. But the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony too consistent and detailed to be dismissed as mere fabrication. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts, including multiple charges of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit various other crimes. Madame Delacroix showed no reaction when the verdict was read, though Marie, watching from the gallery, thought she saw something flicker in those pale green eyes, some acknowledgement that the game was finally over and she had lost. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. There were attempts at appeal, of course, legal maneuvering by lawyers, who hoped to find some technicality that might overturn the conviction, but all of them failed. The evidence was too strong, the political pressure too intense, and there were too many powerful people who had decided that Madame Delacroix knew too much and needed to be silenced permanently before she could bargain her knowledge for leniency. Marie attended the execution, standing in the crowd that gathered outside the parish prison on a cold morning in January 1839. She watched as Madame Delacroix was led to the gallows, her head held high, refusing the hood that was offered to her. Even in death, she was performing, playing the role of the tragic victim rather than the monster she actually was. And when the trapdoor opened and her body dropped, when the snap of her neck echoed across the courtyard, Marie felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice served. She felt only a vast emptiness, a recognition that while this particular horror had ended, the systems that had enabled it remained intact, and somewhere else in this city or in 100 other cities, the same evil would be taking root again, finding new victims, perpetuating the same cycle of exploitation and suffering. William Garrison published a series of articles about the case, using it as a springboard to discuss the broader issues of women's vulnerability in American society, the ways in which legal systems failed to protect those who were already marginalized and powerless. Some people read his words and felt moved to advocate for change. Others dismissed them as the ravings of a radical, someone who wanted to overturn the natural order of society for misguided, ideological reasons. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, and progress, when it came at all, came slowly and incompletely. As for Marie, she left New Orleans after the trial concluded, using money that William Garrison had helped her secure through a victims' compensation fund. She traveled north to Philadelphia, where she found work in a textile factory and tried to build a new life from the fragments of the old one. She never married, never had children, the trauma of her time in Madame Delacroix's house having left scars that went too deep to heal completely. But she survived, which was its own form of victory, and she told her story to anyone who would listen, adding her voice to the growing chorus of those who demanded that society acknowledge and address the suffering it so often preferred to ignore. The house on Silver Springs Road was torn down within a year of Madame Delacroix's execution. The land sold to a developer who built warehouses on the site, but the story of what had happened there lingered in the collective memory of New Orleans, a ghost that haunted the city's conscience. Parents told it to their daughters as a warning about the dangers that lurked beneath the glittering surface of urban life. Reformers cited it as evidence of the need for better laws and better enforcement. And slowly, very slowly, things began to change. Laws were passed that provided more protection for women, that made it harder for establishments like Madame Delacroix's to operate with impunity. Police departments created special units focused on investigating human trafficking and exploitation. Social service organizations developed programs to help vulnerable women find alternatives to prostitution. None of these changes happened quickly or completely, and even today, more than a century and a half later, the problems that Marie faced have not been entirely solved. But every small improvement, every incremental change, represents the legacy of those who refused to remain silent in the face of horror, who spoke truth to power even when it cost them dearly. Marie lived to be 73 years old, dying in her sleep in a modest apartment in Philadelphia in the summer of 1894. She left behind no family, few possessions, but she did leave a memoir, a manuscript that she had worked on for decades, detailing her experiences in New Orleans and her views on the social conditions that made places like Madame Delacroix's house possible. The memoir was published posthumously, and while it never became a bestseller, it found an audience among those who were working to address the issues it raised, and it continues to be read and studied by scholars interested in the history of women's rights and the long struggle for human dignity and freedom. The lesson of Marie's story, if there is one, is not that justice always prevails or that good always triumphs over evil. The world is more complicated than that, more ambiguous, more resistant to simple moral narratives. The real lesson is about the importance of bearing witness, of refusing to let horror remain hidden in the darkness where it can flourish unchallenged. It is about the courage it takes to speak truth when silence would be safer, to stand up for others when it would be easier to look away. And it is about the recognition that freedom is not a gift bestowed by the powerful on the powerless, but a right that must be claimed and defended, often at great cost, by those who refuse to accept their oppression as inevitable or permanent. The Madame of Silver Springs, who branded her girls with heated irons, became a symbol of everything that was wrong with a society that treated human beings as property, that valued profit over people, that allowed the suffering of the vulnerable to continue as long as it remained hidden from public view. And the girls who suffered in that house, who bore the physical and psychological scars of their captivity, became symbols of resilience and resistance, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit retains the capacity to hope, to fight, to demand something better. The horror that closed New Orleans, as the newspapers called it, did not actually close the city. New Orleans continued to exist, continued to be a place of both beauty and ugliness, of culture and corruption, of celebration and suffering. But the city was changed by what had been revealed. forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself and about the price that was being paid by the most vulnerable among its inhabitants. And that change, however incomplete, however insufficient, represented a small victory for those who believed that human dignity and freedom were not negotiable, that justice, however imperfect, was worth fighting for, and that silence in the face of evil was itself a form of evil that must be resisted at every turn. Marie's brand, the elaborate D that Madame Delacroix had seared into her shoulder, remained with her for the rest of her life. But she chose to see it not as a mark of shame or ownership, but as a reminder of what she had survived and what she had helped to change. She kept it uncovered sometimes, letting people see it when she told her story, using it as a visual representation of the cost of exploitation and the price of freedom. And when she died, she requested that her body be cremated so that even that last physical reminder of Madame Delacroix's cruelty would be consumed by flame and dispersed to the winds, leaving behind only the story itself, the witness that could not be silenced, the truth that refused to die.